I used to believe that no matter what happened, my father would always remember who I was, his daughter, his little girl, the one who used to fall asleep on his shoulder while he watched late-night TV, the one he swore he'd protect from the world. But that night, he looked at me as if I was a stranger. It was raining hard, the kind of rain that makes every sound heavier, every silence sharper. I stood on his porch, holding a small bag of groceries and a box of his favorite tea, a peace offering. We hadn't spoken in months after a fight that neither of us truly won. I thought maybe if I just showed up, we could fix things. That's what daughters do, right? They forgive. They try again. But when he opened the door, the look in his eyes wasn't anger. It was emptiness, like he didn't even recognize me. "Can I help you?" he asked. For a moment, I thought he was joking. I smiled nervously. "Dad, it's Nee." But he didn't smile back. He just stood there, confused, cautious even. My heart sank. I thought maybe he was tired, maybe he'd been drinking. But then his voice cracked. "I think you have the wrong house." It felt like the ground disappeared under my feet. The man who had once carried me on his shoulders, who taught me how to ride a bike, now looked at me like I was some lost stranger at his door. My throat tightened. "Dad, please, it's me. But the words wouldn't come out, because in his eyes there was nothing. No spark of recognition. No warmth. Just confusion. Maybe fear. Behind him, I saw the house, familiar and foreign all at once. The same couch where we used to sit together. The same clock ticking softly on the wall. Everything was the same, except him. And in that moment, I realized something far worse than being forgotten, being erased from someone's heart while you're still standing right in front of them. I didn't know then that this night would break me in ways I wasn't ready for, that it would force me to face truths about love, loss, and the fragile bond between parent and child. But standing there, soaked in the rain, all I knew was this. The man who had once been my hero no longer remembered who I was. Before that night, my father and I had always shared a bond that felt unbreakable. He wasn't just my dad. He was my best friend. Growing up, he was the one who taught me how to stand up for myself, how to work hard, how to never let anyone see me cry. He was my teacher, my protector, and my biggest cheerleader. When I was little, he'd come home tired from work, his hands rough, his shirt smelling faintly of sawdust. But no matter how exhausted he was, he'd still sit with me on the floor and help me with my school projects. We didn't have much, but he made sure I never felt like we were missing anything. He used to say, "As long as we have each other, we're rich." And I believed him. But somewhere along the way, things changed. Maybe it was after Mom left. Maybe it was when his business started falling apart. The man who once laughed loudly and hugged me tight became quiet, distant. He started drinking. Not a lot at first, just enough to dull the edges of his sadness. But as the months passed, it became his escape, and I became invisible. I tried everything to bring him back. I'd visit after work, cook his favorite meals, try to make him laugh the way I used to, but every time he'd just nod, barely looking at me. His eyes would drift to the TV or to the half-empty glass beside him. I told myself it was just a phase, that one day he'd wake up and realize how much he was pushing me away. But love can't compete with pain that deep, and I didn't know how to heal what I couldn't see. Then came the fight, the one that changed everything. It started small, like most fights do. I told him he needed to stop drinking, that he was destroying himself. He told me I didn't understand, that I was just a kid pretending to be a parent. The argument turned sharp, fast. Words we didn't mean, or maybe words we meant too much, came spilling out. He shouted that I'd abandoned him just like my mother did. I shouted that he'd already abandoned me long before. When I left that night, I slammed the door behind me and told myself I'd never go back. But guilt has a way of softening even the deepest anger. So, a few months later, when I heard from a neighbor that he wasn't doing well, I decided to visit him, to fix what was broken. I had no idea that the man I was going to see wasn't the same man I grew up with, that the pain I thought we could fix had already taken him from me in ways I couldn't yet understand. When I pulled up to his house that night, everything looked the same. The faded blue paint, the porch light flickering weakly, the old rocking chair still creaking in the wind. But there was something in the air, something I couldn't name, a heaviness that made my chest tighten before I even knocked. The rain had just started, soft but steady. I remember thinking how much he used to love nights like this. He'd sit by the window with a mug of tea and tell me stories about his childhood, so I brought him his favorite tea, thinking it might make him smile, thinking maybe we could start over. When the door finally opened, he stood there in the dim light, thinner than I remembered, older somehow. His eyes were red, not from anger, but from something deeper, something hollow. For a few seconds, he just stared at me. "Dad?" I said softly. "It's me." He blinked, confused. Then in a voice I barely recognized, he asked, "Do I know you?" I laughed awkwardly, waiting for the punchline, but it never came. He looked at me like I was a stranger, one who had shown up at his door with no right to be there. "It's me," I tried again. "Your daughter." His brows furrowed. He shook his head slowly, stepping back. "My daughter's not here. She doesn't come around anymore." The words hit harder than I expected. "Dad, please, it's me. Look at me." But he wouldn't. He turned away, muttering under his breath, something about people who only showed up when they wanted something. My heart pounded in my chest. I stepped inside before he could stop me, desperate to make him remember. The house smelled of dust and stale liquor. The photos that once lined the walls were gone, replaced with empty hooks and faint outlines where memories used to hang. On the coffee table sat an open bottle, a half-filled glass, and a stack of unpaid bills. I tried to steady my voice. "You don't have to do this alone, Dad. I'm here now." He froze. Then he looked at me, really looked at me, and said something I'll never forget. "I don't need anything from you. My daughter made her choice." I felt my throat close. "What choice?" I whispered. "The choice to leave," he said quietly, his voice breaking. "She left me, just like her mother." It was then that I realized the truth. He wasn't angry at me, not really. He was lost. Lost in a world where pain had rewritten his memories, where the people he loved most had become ghosts that haunted him. Somewhere in his mind, I was gone. And maybe, in a way, I had been. Tears blurred my vision as I reached for his hand, but he pulled away. "Please," I begged, "it's me. I never stopped caring." But he only looked through me, as if searching for a face he could no longer remember. The silence between us felt endless, like standing at the edge of something you can't fix. Finally, I stepped back. The rain outside had grown louder, beating against the roof like a heartbeat. I wanted to stay, to fight for him, to bring him back. But how do you reach someone who no longer knows you exist? So I did the hardest thing I've ever done. I whispered, "I love you, Dad," even though I knew he wouldn't understand. Then I turned and walked out into the rain. As the door closed behind me, I realized something I would carry forever. Sometimes the people you love don't leave all at once. Sometimes they fade, memory by memory, moment by moment, until the only thing left is the echo of who they used to be. I don't remember much about the drive home that night. Just the sound of rain on the windshield and the taste of salt from my own tears. The world outside blurred into streaks of light and water, but inside, everything felt painfully sharp. Every memory of my father, every laugh, every promise, they all came rushing back like waves crashing against a shore that could no longer hold them. I kept replaying his words in my head. My daughter made her choice. It felt like a knife twisting slowly, not because of what he said, but because deep down, I knew he believed it. He truly thought I'd left him. He truly thought I'd stopped loving him. And no matter how many times I told myself it wasn't his fault, that his mind was slipping, that it was the illness talking, it didn't make it hurt any less. The next few days passed in a haze. I tried calling him, but he never answered. Sometimes the line rang endlessly. Other times it went straight to voicemail. I told myself he was busy, asleep, distracted. Anything but gone. But in my heart, I knew something had shifted that night. I hadn't just lost my father's memory. I had lost my place in his world. I spoke to the neighbor who had told me he wasn't doing well. She said he'd been forgetting a lot lately. Names, faces, days. He'd wander outside late at night asking strangers if they'd seen his wife or his daughter. The words sent chills down my spine, because the truth I'd been avoiding was now staring me in the face. My father was sick, and I had been too busy trying to fix the relationship to see that his mind was breaking. I spent the next few weeks researching, calling doctors, asking for help. But he refused every offer. "I don't need a doctor," he'd snap whenever I tried. "I just need people to stop telling me what's wrong with me." It was like watching someone you love drown while they keep insisting they're fine. Sometimes I'd drive by his house just to make sure he was okay. Once I saw him sitting on the porch, staring out into the rain like he was waiting for someone. I almost got out of the car, but something stopped me. The fear that he wouldn't recognize me again. That I'd walk up to him and he'd call me by another name. That he'd look at me and see nothing. The guilt became a constant companion. I blamed myself for leaving that night after our fight. I blamed myself for not noticing the signs sooner. I blamed myself for everything, even though the logical part of me knew it wasn't my fault. But guilt doesn't listen to logic. It feeds on love, especially the kind that's lost. A month later, I got a call from the hospital. My father had collapsed in a grocery store. They said he was confused, asking for his daughter but unable to remember her name. When I arrived, he was lying in a hospital bed, eyes half open, looking fragile in a way I'd never seen before. I held his hand, and for a second, I thought he recognized me. But then he smiled faintly and said, "You remind me of my little girl. She was kind." I smiled back, even as my heart shattered. "She still is," I whispered. That night, I sat beside him until he fell asleep, listening to the beeping of the monitor, watching his chest rise and fall. I wanted so badly to tell him everything, how much I loved him, how sorry I was, how I'd never stopped being his daughter. But words felt too small for this kind of love, too fragile for the kind of loss that doesn't have an end. As I left the hospital, I realized something I hadn't before. Sometimes closure doesn't come as an apology or a goodbye. Sometimes it's learning to love someone even when they can no longer love you back in the same way. And as painful as it was, I understood that remembering him, truly remembering him, was my way of keeping him alive, even when his own mind couldn't. In the days after my father's collapse, the house felt quieter than ever. Every corner carried an echo of him, the sound of his laughter, the smell of his aftershave, the chair he always sat in by the window. But now, instead of warmth, those memories felt like ghosts brushing against me, reminders of what I had lost and what I could never get back. I visited him in the hospital every day. Sometimes he'd greet me with a smile, calling me by my name like he used to. Other times, he'd look at me with kind confusion, mistaking me for a nurse or worse, not seeing me at all. Each visit was a gamble. Would I get a glimpse of my father? Or just the shadow of who he used to be? At first, I kept hoping he'd get better. I read every article about memory therapy, joined support groups, and even tried showing him old photos to trigger his recollection. But with every passing week, the truth grew harder to deny. My father wasn't coming back, not in the way I remembered him. His body was still here, but the man who had taught me how to ride a bike, who used to wait up for me when I came home late, who called me his little girl, he was fading. The anger I'd carried for months began to melt into something else. Sorrow, acceptance, love in its most painful form. I realized I had spent so long trying to make him remember me that I had forgotten to simply be with him. So I stopped trying to fix things. I just started sitting by his side, talking about my day, reading to him, sometimes just holding his hand in silence. And even if he didn't know who I was, I knew who he was. That was enough. One afternoon, as sunlight spilled through the blinds, he turned to me and said softly, "You're very kind to me, miss. My daughter used to be like that. I smiled through the ache in my chest and said, "She learned from the best." For a moment, I thought I saw a flicker in his eyes. Something familiar, something real. But then it was gone. That night, as I drove home, I realized the real grief wasn't just losing my father's memory of me. It was learning to live without the need for his recognition, to love him without expecting him to remember, to forgive him, not for forgetting, but for being human. I started writing letters to him, ones he'd never read. I poured every memory, every thank you, every apology into them. It became my way of keeping us connected, even as time and illness pulled us apart. Those letters became a kind of bridge, one that stretched across memory and loss, carrying love that didn't need to be returned to exist. And one morning, as I read one of those letters aloud at his bedside, something inside me finally settled. I realized that being his daughter wasn't about whether he remembered my name. It was about the life we had shared, the love we had built, and the lessons he had left behind in me. Acceptance, I learned, isn't giving up. It's holding on differently, gently, quietly, and with peace. My father may have forgotten me, but I will never forget him. And maybe that's enough. The day I said goodbye to my father didn't come with warning or drama. It was a soft morning in early spring when the world outside smelled of rain and renewal. The hospital room was quiet, except for the rhythmic hum of the machines. I remember walking in with a cup of his favorite coffee, even though I knew he wouldn't drink it. It had become my ritual, something to do with my hands while my heart tried to hold itself together. He was asleep when I arrived, his breathing shallow but peaceful. The light from the window painted soft lines across his face. For the first time in months, he looked free of confusion, calm, almost serene. I pulled a chair closer, sat down, and just watched him. There were no words left to say, only the silent understanding that this might be the last time I'd see him. I took one of the letters I'd written and began to read. My voice trembled at first, but soon it grew steady. I told him about my childhood, how he used to spin me around in the living room, how we built tree houses and burned pancakes on Sunday mornings. I thanked him for every lesson, every moment of patience, every sacrifice he made that I never noticed until I grew up. And then I told him the hardest truth, that I forgave him, not because he asked for it, but because I needed to let the pain go. As I spoke, I reached for his hand, cold, fragile, but still his. His fingers twitched just slightly, and for a split second, I felt that same warmth I used to feel when he held my hand as a child crossing the street. My throat tightened, and tears blurred my vision. I leaned in and whispered, "It's okay, Dad. You can rest now. I'll be okay." The monitor beside his bed beeped slower, softer, and then there was only stillness, the kind of stillness that steals your breath and yet somehow gives you peace. I sat there for a long time, listening to the quiet. I didn't cry, not right away. Instead, I felt a strange calm wash over me, like I'd finally reached the end of a long, painful road. When I finally stood to leave, I kissed his forehead and whispered, "Thank you for being my father, even when you forgot." The words felt final, but freeing. I walked out of that room carrying both grief and gratitude, knowing that love doesn't die when memory fades. It simply changes form. Driving home that evening, I looked out at the sunset, golden and gentle, just like him. I realized that saying goodbye wasn't about letting go. It was about carrying his love forward in a way that honored both of us. Every time I see that shade of light now, I think of him. Not the man who forgot, but the father who once loved me fiercely. That night, I lit a candle by the window and read one last letter aloud. It wasn't for him anymore. It was for me. A promise that I would keep living, keep loving, and keep remembering. Because even though he was gone, the part of him that lived inside me would never fade. Goodbye, Dad. I'll keep your light alive. Grief has a strange rhythm. Some days it's heavy and suffocating. Other days it's quiet, almost kind. In the weeks after my father's passing, I moved through my days like someone learning how to live again. The silence in my apartment felt unbearable at first. I would still set out 2 cups of coffee in the morning, one for me, one for him. then stare at it until the steam disappeared. It was my way of holding on to him just a little longer. But healing didn't come in grand moments. It came in small ones. A walk under a soft rain, a song on the radio that reminded me of our road trips, a letter I found in an old drawer with his handwriting on it. Slowly, those moments stopped breaking me and started bringing me peace. I began to understand that love isn't meant to chain us to pain. It's meant to guide us back to ourselves. One evening, I visited the park where he used to take me as a child. The air smelled of grass and distant laughter. I sat on our old bench, the wood still carved with our initials. I closed my eyes and let the memories play. His laughter, his voice calling me kiddo, the way his hand always found mine. For the first time, I didn't cry. Instead, I smiled, because even though he was gone, the love we shared hadn't vanished. It had transformed into strength. That night, I wrote in my journal, healing doesn't mean forgetting. It means remembering, with softness instead of sorrow. And that became my new promise, not just to him, but to myself. I would keep his lessons alive not by clinging to grief, but by living the kind of life he'd be proud of. Months later, I found myself visiting my mother's house. She asked how I'd been, and for the first time in years, I didn't hide behind the word fine. I told her the truth, that I missed him, that I was learning to forgive, and that I finally understood what love really meant. Her eyes softened, and she reached across the table to hold my hand. In that moment, I realized healing doesn't just happen within you. It ripples outward, mending the spaces between people too. Now, whenever I feel lost, I look up at the night sky. Somewhere, in the quiet expanse of stars, I imagine he's still watching, maybe even proud. And I whisper, I'm okay, Dad. I'm finally okay. Because the truth is, I am. The pain is still there, but it no longer owns me. What remains is love, steady, eternal, and bright enough to light even the darkest parts of me. And that's how I know I've healed.